One thing I figured out pretty early in my life as a movie nerd, or as I like to refer to myself, a film aficionado, is that watching bad movies can be just as interesting and rewarding as watching good movies. One of the greatest gifts the TV show Mystery Science Theater 3000 gave to me, along with more or less shaping my sense of humor for the last 30 years, was to show me that a bad movie can lead to a good time if you watch it and respond to it in the right frame of mind, and if you have some friends around to enjoy it with you. Bad movies can make us laugh, make us angry, surprise us, baffle us, evoke our sympathy and our admiration, even inspire us in certain ways. That's because bad movies come in so many varieties, but despite this dizzying diversity of cinematic sinkholes, I think most bad movies can be sorted into one of three main categories. That doesn't mean there aren't exceptions that don't obviously belong in one of these categories or that might fit in more than one. There are, but generally speaking, by my reckoning, here are the three kinds of bad movies. Cheap and shoddy. These are the low-budget movies, the technically inferior movies, the movies produced by filmmakers whose ambition exceeds their abilities. Chances are, if I were to ask you to name one of the worst movies ever made, you'd choose a movie that belongs in this category. The Golden Turkey Awards, a book written by the Medved brothers that was published in 1980 and helped to inspire a new generation of fascination with bad movies, highlights multiple films from this category, including 1950s sci-fi clunker Robot Monster and the infamously bad and bizarre 1960s TV movie They Saved Hitler's Brain. I don't think The Golden Turkey Awards is a very good book, nor is Michael Medved a very good movie critic, but the Medveds did accomplish one thing. They identified the film that is still, to this day, the default choice for worst movie ever made, and also the most obvious exemplar of the cheap and shoddy kind of bad movie. Plan 9 from Outer Space. Plan 9, written and directed by Ed Wood, has all of the defining characteristics of this first category. It was made for relatively little money, $60,000 in the late 50s, which is the equivalent of about $500,000 of today's dollars. It boasts laughably unconvincing sets and special effects, inexperienced actors giving amateurish performances, and a serious lack of basic technical competence. But like most of the well-known movies that fall into this category, it also has an odd sort of charm. This is the case with several of Ed Wood's movies. Bride of the Monster, Glen or Glenda, Jailbait. They're all bad. But they're bad in really fascinating, idiosyncratic ways. They're lurid, they're campy, they're saturated with Wood's personal neuroses. They share these qualities in common with the present-day equivalent of Ed Wood, Neil Breen, the writer-director of such dubious masterpieces as Double Down and Fateful Findings. Breen's movies, like Wood's, play like the work of someone who has never seen a movie, but overheard movies being described in a conversation he was only half paying attention to. The results are entire films that exist in a kind of uncanny valley. They look and sound enough like movies that they remind us of what movies are supposed to be like, but there's just something off about them. And therein lies the fascination. That's why I think most of the best-known bad movies are of this type. Of course, not all cheap and shoddy movies are like this. Most of them are just forgettable garbage. There are cheap DVD sets and forgotten corners of streaming services full of such films that almost no one ever watches or talks about. But every once in a while, up pops an Ed Wood or a Neil Breen or a Coleman Francis. They aren't trying to make bad movies. Quite the opposite. They're obviously trying very hard to make great movies, movies that mean a lot to them personally, movies with what they think is something important to say. The movies fail not for lack of effort or ambition, but because the filmmakers don't have enough money or technical support to realize their vision, or because they just aren't very talented. The films and filmmakers in this next category don't have those excuses. Fancy duds.
Oh, you're too much!
When lovers of bad movies talk about cheap and shoddy films, we often do so with more than a little affection, with a smile on our lips and a twinkle in our eye. That is less frequently the case when it comes to this second kind of bad movie. These are the movies that have every advantage that anyone could ask for: money, studio support, the involvement of talented professional people, and still somehow manage to fail, sometimes spectacularly. Movies in this category don't attract the same appreciation as movies in the first category because they don't have as many mitigating circumstances to appeal to in order to account for what went wrong. Or at least that's what I think. You look at Plan 9 from Outer Space, and you think, well, it's pretty bad, but it's also probably the best movie that Ed Wood could have made. You look at the Star Wars prequels, different situation. Not everybody thinks the Star Wars prequels are bad. For reasons that escape me, some fans and critics have attempted to rehab the reputation of the prequels in recent years, which is fine. People like different things for different reasons. That's the deal. I'm just saying I don't get it. But among those of us who do think the prequels are bad, they serve as ideal representatives of this particular category. The prequels aren't bad in a fun way. They're bad in a way that makes them a chore to watch. They're boring, they're dense, they're cluttered, they're too long, they're preposterous in a way that's annoying rather than entertaining. They do offer us some insight into the mind of the director, but where the films of Ed Wood grant us a glimpse into the warped but creative imagination of a singular and compelling weirdo, the main thing the prequels tell us about George Lucas is that he has very different ideas than most other people about what makes Star Wars appealing. And that's certainly interesting, but it's not interesting in a way that makes his crummy movies more enjoyable to sit through. Most movies in this category are ill-conceived from the start. They don't fail because of lack of money or talent. George Lucas has shown himself capable of making a good movie in the past, and he had all the money he needed and then some to make the prequels. They fail because of deep, fundamental flaws. And when I say fail, I mean creatively, not financially. Some of the movies in this category were box office bombs, but some, like the Star Wars prequels, for example, made great, towering heaps of money. With the Star Wars prequels, the fundamental flaw is that Lucas devoted 3 movies trying to wring a story out of material that works much better as backstory. Other prominent entries in this category have similar flaws. Peter Jackson remade King Kong, a lean, somewhat lurid special effects movie about a giant ape, as an overblown 3.5-hour fantasy epic. Michael Bay's Armageddon, like most of Bay's other work, is loud, dumb, shallow, mawkish, tasteless, and mean-spirited. Battlefield Earth, producer and star John Travolta's tribute to his late beloved cult leader L. Ron Hubbard, plays as one baffling miscalculation after another. Lazy plotting, ugly visuals, bad jokes, stilted performances. Films like these are the work of people who should know better and can do better, but don't. Maybe it's because of studio meddling, maybe it's because the script read better on the page than it looked on screen, maybe it's because a director or a producer got too full of themselves and needed someone to guide them or rein them in, and no one ever did. Whatever the reason, these are the movies that leave us shaking our heads, marveling at how a studio could hire so many talented people and spend so much money and wind up with that. The thing is, even if we're talking about the very worst big-budget bomb ever made, Waterworld, Catwoman, that Mike Myers version of The Cat in the Hat, or any of the other movies I've mentioned, the worst you can say about it is that it's a lousy movie. And ultimately, that's not really so terrible. On the scale of human suffering, watching a shitty movie has got to rank relatively low, wouldn't you think? It might feel unpleasant or like a waste of our time, but there's nothing indecent or dishonorable about a bad movie. Unless there is. Which brings me to the third category.
This is Sparta!
Morally repugnant. This lowest circle of cinematic hell is reserved for movies that are bad because of their reprehensible content. These movies are competently made, maybe even technically or artistically accomplished, but the stories they tell, the characters they celebrate, or the messages they contain make them impossible to enjoy or recommend as anything other than object lessons and cautionary tales. Now, before I go any further, let me make something clear. People have been making lists of morally objectionable films for as long as there have been films. Most of those lists are produced and disseminated by conservative religious groups who want to warn their followers about films that would be offensive to their pious sensibilities. This usually translates to a puritanical opposition to depictions of sexuality, especially homosexuality, and to films that include themes and ideas about religion that are judged to be subversive. One of the most influential of these groups in the United States was the Legion of Decency, which was loosely affiliated with the Catholic Church and which, over the course of its 45 years of existence, condemned such films as Breathless, La Ventura, Jules and Jim, 8½, The Producers, A Clockwork Orange, Last Tango in Paris, The Wicker Man, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, The Outlaw Josie Wales, and The Omen. Not sure what their problem with that last one was. If I remember correctly, it was pretty anti-Satan. I'm not using the term morally repugnant in the same way as the Legion of Decency or some other bunch of reactionary right-wing alarmists. My bar for moral repugnance is a lot higher than is irreverent toward religion or acknowledges that gay people exist. When I talk about films that are morally repugnant, I mean films that are, for example, racist, or misogynist, or homophobic, or transphobic. Not movies that merely have characters that are any of those things, but movies which are those things themselves, that tell stories built upon bigoted assumptions, or carrying bigoted messages. The prime example of a movie from this category is 1915's The Birth of a Nation, directed by D.W. Griffith. Technically speaking, there's not a thing wrong with this movie. In fact, it's one of the most important and influential films ever made. Griffith is often credited with inventing the modern language of film. Throughout Birth of a Nation, he uses close-ups, tracking shots, and other camera movements, cross-cutting between parallel sequences to build suspense, and numerous other techniques which at the time were extremely innovative. Griffith himself didn't invent any of these techniques, but he employed them more extensively and with greater sophistication than any filmmaker before him. He was, to the language of cinema, what Shakespeare was to the English language, taking pieces that were already there and arranging them like no one else ever had in ways that would influence everyone who came after him. Unfortunately, this landmark of the form, this magnum opus, is also one of the most racist films ever made. For those of you who don't know, Birth of a Nation is the epic story of two American families, one from the North, the other from the South, and their experiences before, during, and after the Civil War. The hero of the film is a Confederate officer who returns home after the war to found the Ku Klux Klan, which is depicted as a noble and benevolent force fighting back against the Northern tyranny of Reconstruction. The main villain of the film is a Northern politician of mixed race who seeks to persecute and punish the white people of the South while elevating the crude and simple-minded blacks who follow him into the ruling class. It's basically the white supremacist propaganda version of Reconstruction, with blacks depicted practicing mass voter fraud, black men portrayed as lustful animals preying on innocent white women, and the Klan heroically riding to the rescue for the thrilling climax. The film's final minutes include a scene of blacks showing up to vote on the next election day, only to be blocked by a gang of armed Klansmen. This is presented as a good thing. The natural order has been restored. So, yeah, white people, particularly Southern white people, are heroes fighting for freedom and justice. Black people are subhuman animals and criminals, and whites who sympathize with blacks and fight for their rights are traitors and tyrants. Oh, and most of the major black characters are played by white actors in blackface, so there's that on top of everything else. It's shockingly racist. It's stunningly frank in its racism. It's so thoroughly, excessively, upsettingly racist that even in 1915, a lot of white people who saw it were looking at each other like, did that seem kind of racist to you? It's so racist that its racism blots out its admirable qualities, which are numerous and substantial. It is an artistic and technical landmark, an innovative, influential, transformative, revolutionary work. And none of that matters, because hanging over everything else about Birth of a Nation is the inescapable fact that it is a work of hateful, ignorant propaganda. And movies like that are what this category is for. Other examples would be the documentaries of Leni Riefenstahl, who produced and directed the most infamous propaganda film ever made, Triumph of the Will, which records and celebrates the 1934 Nazi Party Congress at Nuremberg. The film is technically superb, even visually stunning at times, but did I mention it's Nazi propaganda? It's Nazi propaganda. 3 years after Triumph of the Will, Riefenstahl released Olympia, her documentary about the 1936 Berlin Olympics, which is a much softer form of propaganda, but still shows the Third Reich in a very positive light. Those Nazis sure can throw an Olympics, can't they? Removed from its political context, Olympia is one of the finest and most important documentaries ever made. In many ways, it is to documentary filmmaking what Griffith's Birth of a Nation is to dramatic filmmaking. Many of the techniques Riefenstahl innovated or adapted are still in use today, and her use of music and editing to craft suspenseful, compelling, engrossing scenes from documentary footage is incredibly influential. It's just too bad she put her imagination and ingenuity to work in the service of Hitler. Kinda spoils the whole thing, you know? Not every movie in this category is a would-be masterpiece ruined by its bigotry or shitty politics. Some are already terrible movies that are made even worse by their bigotry and shitty politics, like 300, directed by Zack Snyder, whose contributions to the DC Extended Universe definitely belong in the second category, which is probably where 300 would go too if it wasn't such a pornographic glorification of fascism and misogyny. Oh, and let's not forget how homophobic it is. And also how racist. It depicts ancient Persians as giant gay monsters. Isn't that fun? Pornographic glorification of fascism and misogyny, homophobia, racism, gratuitous violence dressed up with excessive slow motion and saturated in a sweaty film of pretentious pseudo-philosophy are stylistic hallmarks of Snyder, but in 300 he takes it a step beyond his usual loud, shallow, obnoxious nonsense by presenting ancient Sparta, a brutal, militaristic, xenophobic society that served as a major inspiration for 20th century fascists, including the Nazis, as a bastion of nobility and civilization. And by the way, that's not me complaining about the film's historical inaccuracies, which I don't really care about, but of which there are many. The brutality, militarism, xenophobia, and general awfulness of the ancient Spartans are present in the film. They're just meant to be seen as good things. Because guy they hired to make Superman movies, Zack Snyder, thinks the ancient Spartans were awesome. So those are the three kinds of bad movies, along with a few representative examples of each. Which category does your favorite, or least favorite, bad movie belong in? Is there a bad movie you think doesn't fit in any of these three categories? Is there a fourth kind of bad movie I've overlooked? Or am I just completely wrong about this whole thing? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to read what you have to say, because here's another thing I figured out during my life as a movie film aficionado. It's all subjective. good movie, kinds of bad movies, what makes something a bad movie, etc., etc. These aren't statements of empirical fact. These are opinions, preferences, matters of taste. The whole point of videos like this isn't to prove anything or win any arguments. It's to express ourselves, share our thoughts, and take part in a conversation about something we all love. So, share your thoughts with me, and let's have a conversation. As long as we can all agree that this right here is pretty messed up. I'm sure we can all do that. Can't we?